Welcome to Science Frontiers, a space for discussions in the frontier areas of science, technology, and society. I'm your host, Binay Panda. In today's episode, we shall discuss higher education in India, its state compared to other nations, and what India should do to achieve excellence in the field of higher education and research. To discuss this, we have a very special guest today, Philip Altbach, an emeritus professor and distinguished fellow and the founding director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. Professor Altbach is one of the foremost experts in international higher education and has extensively worked and written on higher education systems in many countries, including India. Philip, welcome to the forum and thank you for joining.
Delighted to be here.
Now, as you know, India came up with a critical document called National Education Policy 2020 or NEP 2020 that recommends substantial changes in the system and provides recommendations towards making India a global knowledge superpower. As you know, India is the world's second largest higher education system. The plan is to double the gross enrollment rates from the current 27% to 50% by 2035 and increase spending from public exchequer on education from 3% to 6%, which is doubling it of the GDP. Now, these are on paper, and it will take time to implement the policy once the budgetary allocation is realized. With a growing economy and soon to be world's fourth largest economy, surpassing Japan in the coming year, do you think India has done justice to the field of higher education? I mean, has it provided what it requires to excel in the field of higher education in general, and most importantly, promote research universities in particular, especially when mass education is the priority?
Absolutely not. I think India has. I agree with the underpinnings of your sort of question statement just now entirely. Let me say a couple things by background. First of all, India has underfunded higher education from the beginning. So it's really never been adequately funded by either the central government and particularly from almost all of the states, because as we all know, higher education in India, which is a joint responsibility of the state and the center, most of the funding and most of the guidance comes from the states. And they have been particularly deficient in thinking about higher education and implementing any kind of reasonable plan. So the first thing is lack of funding. And as you point out, NEP does say, underline say, that it will increase the budget significantly. I think, and I don't follow India on a day-to-day basis very closely, I think basically none of that has happened as yet. And the NEP has been sort of in operation for several years now, that until that happens, really not much progress can be made. And also, I think there's a mistake in thinking about the future of the university in the sense that India now has, it's fair to say, none, zero comprehensive research universities. If you look at the rankings, which I myself am rather critical of, but it's all we have. If you look at the global higher education rankings, as you know, there are three big ones. India is sort of no place in those rankings. The only institutions which score at all are the IITs and the Indian Institute of Science a little bit, but basically India is not there. And for the world's, as you say, soon to be fourth largest economy, having nobody in the top of the rankings is shocking, problematical for the future of the economy, because science and research is so much part of the future of a sophisticated economy and a world-class system of economic growth. I think India has a lot to catch up on.
And thank you. And one question which comes from your answer is separating or dichotomizing education from research. Now, as you mentioned that we don't have any universities in the top ranking, and without going into the vagaries or like the deficiency of the ranking system, there is a thinking for the last 5 decades which has actually resulted in the deterioration of our university system is delinking research from the teaching, which in my opinion is extremely deleterious, because if you look around the world, research and teaching go together. So what do you have to say about the system that is prevalent in India, and thinking that research can only be done and should only be done in research institutes, and universities should focus primarily on education?
I agree with you entirely about that point. I think the best research is done in institutions which combine research and teaching. And I think if you look back in history, when India gained independence, it was significantly looking at the Soviet Union as a model for many things, including to some extent higher education. And the Soviet model was to have these research institutes of the Soviet Academy, now Russian Academy of Science, separate from universities. And they found out, the Russians, over the years, that that was not particularly effective. And those separate institutes doing only research fell behind. And I happen to have been on a Russian government commission recently, that is prior to the Ukraine conflict. And they have been trying to weaken the academies of science and integrate them more with the universities. Even they realize that separating research from teaching is not a good idea. So I think in the India case, of course, although you do have some very good research institutes, I can think of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research as an example. It would be much better, more effective, more in keeping with a world-class economy to better integrate them. So I would hope that that integration would take place, because it's better for science, it's better for teaching, it's better for the faculty, it's just more effective.
Absolutely. And we think that that's only possible if we have the infrastructure in our universities actually keep up. And that brings to the next question that I want to discuss about privatization of higher education. And this is something that you know and have written extensively about in the last many decades. As you know, unlike in the US, where public universities, at least the prominent ones, can rival in infrastructure and facilities, particularly facilities for the experimental research and also for the students, as good as the best private ones. However, in India, private universities come in two flavors. First, the elite ones that charge hefty annual fees, and where there is excellent infrastructure for students and teachers, both for teaching as well as for doing research. And the bottom 90% of others, the private universities, where the infrastructure is not adequate, facilities are not good, and they do not provide good prospects for our students. In your opinion, do you think privatization of higher education is the right thing for a country like India, considering especially our history and the socio-economic condition of many of Indians, both in the elite as well as in other private universities?
That is a super complicated, multifaceted question. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. I think one of the really interesting phenomena in higher education, not just in India, but globally, has been really in the last decade or two, the rise, as you point out, of some very well-funded, not-for-profit, philanthropically focused private universities. I think here of Ashoka and Jindal and half a dozen, maybe a little more others. those are really good universities now, as you point out, very good facilities, fairly selective hiring of faculty, mostly on the international market. Um, Good students, mostly from wealthy families, because as you correctly point out, they charge a lot of money. Some of them have good scholarship programs, but only for a minority of the students, and very good facilities, and a focus on research. So in a way, they're like the growth of the private universities in America at the end of the 19th century, when a man like John D. Rockefeller, at that time the richest guy in the world, funded by himself the University of Chicago, which is now among the top 10 research universities in the entire world. And there are a number of others, Carnegie Mellon and quite a few other prestigious privates funded by rich people. And India is going through perhaps the same kind of development. And I think that's great. You know, it's important that this rich class, which has developed in India, and you can say whatever you want about it, that they are opening their eyes to the need for good higher education, possibly for their own kids, the ones that they don't send abroad for study. And I think it's a very good development. Now, second point is India has always had a very large private sector. Indeed, the largest private sector in the world. What is it? There are 50,000 colleges in the country. That's more than the total number of universities worldwide, exist just in India. Many of these, and most of them are private, and many of them are unaided. In other words, they get no money from either the state or central government at all. So they're on their own. And as you point out, they're pretty bad in many cases and do not lead to good careers for the students who go there. It's well known that the big tech companies, Infosys and others, have to have their own upgrading colleges for engineering graduates from many of these low-end private institutions. So I think there's a real problem. India sort of looked at trying to solve it through a quality assurance system, which by and large is not particularly effective, but it would be important to sort of beef up. Short answer is the large majority of private colleges need to be improved. I think the private sector, because of its history, because of the large numbers in India, because of the financial resources of particularly the state governments, they're here to stay. And they're an integral part of the system and will be there forever. At the same time, it's extremely important, especially for the state governments, to improve the public funding and the number of and quality of public universities and colleges in the various Indian states. So because they're going to be, as in the United States, as an example, our prestigious privates. Remember, in America, unlike India, 80% of students go to public higher education, largely relatively unselective and a reasonably good system. You can find some really bad ones, but most public universities, the unselective ones that you don't read about in the rankings or in the newspapers or in the media, are pretty good institutions and provide a pretty good education, leading to good jobs for their graduates. So that's a long answer to a complicated but extremely important question.
Absolutely. And I think, privatization of education, as you said, in India had been existing for quite a long time and will exist. And it's a good thing when rich people actually donate for the cause of higher education and research. The question is that the higher education in privately funded, whether it is for profit or non-for-profit, is great, but that should not happen at the cost of the public institution. And that's the bigger point, that as you mentioned and reinforced, that the public exchequer must spend in strengthening the infrastructure and the facilities in public institutions. And because we are a large country, the privatization will always happen. And it's a good thing when people donate for the system as a whole. Now, let's move to another topic, which is receiving a lot of attention recently, which is the internationalization of higher education. India's University Grants Commission, or UGC, as you know, is the statutory body set up to coordinate and maintain higher education standards in India. UGC, through a regulation called the Setting Up and Operation of Campuses of Foreign Higher Educational Institutions in India Regulations 2023, has provided a legal and regulatory framework for foreign universities to establish campuses in India, in line with what is suggested in NEP 2020 recommendations. What are your views on internationalization of higher education in India? And do you think it is necessary to attain excellence? Is the new rule sufficient to attract the best universities in the world to India?
Again, a complicated and multifaceted question, and let me also try to unpack it a little bit. The short answer is yes, internationalization is extraordinarily important. India, for much too long, in my view, in higher education, has relied too much on the Swadeshi idea that you can do it yourself. Higher education globally is an international enterprise. Science is an international enterprise, and more so in the era of the internet and of scientific collaboration, which is so much stronger. As an aside comment, the current decoupling of the United States and China in terms of many things, but including higher education, I think is very unfortunate in terms of the sort of future of innovative scientific research. Back to India. So internationalization is very important. And I was happy to see that the NEP, I think for the first time in history, has recognized that internationalization and the relationship of Indian universities to the rest of the world is an important thing to do for the country, for science, for technology, and so on. So having said that, what's the current status and what's the future? The current status basically is zero. There are a few collaboration arrangements between Indian institutions of higher education and international foreign ones, and that's a good thing. And the legislation now permits more and makes it a bit easier in terms of regulation, and that's a good thing. But there are still a lot of impediments, and I think, unlike a lot of observers, that the best foreign institutions are going to think 2 or 3 or 9 times before entering the Indian market for a number of reasons. One of them significantly is the lack of infrastructure in India for international collaboration. It's no longer completely government regulations that make it impossible. They have been loosened, some, but not all. But it's the ability of the universities, even the best ones, to deal with, to welcome, to engage with an international international institutions, especially the best ones. What I think is going to happen overall is that the ones who are going to be knocking on the door in India are not the best universities in the world. Maybe they're going to be okay ones, and they're going to be in the market to recruit students to if they want to establish a campus in India, and to recruit students to come back to their home campuses in America or Britain or wherever, and not to collaborate on research. What I think is actually more practical for the best Indian universities is to, and what I think the foreigners are going to be top foreigners are going to be most interested in, are collaborations with, on a limited basis, with the better Indian universities, maybe establishing a joint degree in one specific postgraduate area, or a joint research lab, or some kind of other collaboration on a smaller scale. And I think that's probably the best way to go, at least to make a start. My understanding is there are a couple of Australian universities, not the best ones, but quite good, who have expressed their interest in going to the sort of open part of Gift City in Gujarat. And that'll be an interesting experiment if they come. I should point out, if you look at places where foreign institutions have gone and which have been quite successful, where top foreign institutions have gone, generally they have been largely funded by the host country. That is, if you take Education City in Qatar, probably the highest profile such place for collaboration, that's funded entirely by the Qatar Foundation. The local institutions that are there, Georgetown University in America and Carnegie Mellon and a few others, they are almost completely subsidized by the Qatar government. Similar things you see in other parts of the world. In Dubai, where there are a lot of second-rate, frankly, foreign institutions, the government hasn't been so active in the Dubai government hasn't been so active in funding them. But even there, a lot of the infrastructure, the buildings and so on, are locally funded there. So if the Indians are expecting the foreigners to come flocking and building their own campuses with their own money, forget about it. It isn't going to happen. And in many cases, in the UK and especially in the United States, for the public universities, there are legal restrictions in how they can operate overseas, and they are forbidden from spending state money on building overseas campuses. So that's maybe a too long answer to a very complicated question. But the bottom line is, yes, internationalization is super important.
I mean, I'm thankful. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm very thankful that you actually gave the answers to the question that I wanted to ask next, because as you know, the internationalization is not the issue, but the countries where the best foreign universities are there, particularly the Gulf country. You mentioned Qatar, and I know from my own experience of visiting there. And the second one is Saudi Arabia. The host country has pumped billions of dollars, both in terms of providing infrastructure, land, and buildings. So the question comes to a country like India, as you mentioned, is a wishful thinking to understand and to even think that the foreign universities, let alone the best, the Stanford, Harvard, the Oxford, and Cambridge of the world, but even the middle-rated foreign universities to come and spend their own money is not happening.
Not happening. Will not happen. What I think will happen is what I said earlier, that is, lower cost collaborative arrangements with existing Indian universities, and they too have to up their game if they are going to be attractive to the better foreign universities. Up their game in terms of having an infrastructure on campus to deal with internationalization. I've visited a few Indian universities in the past, and because I'm interested in these international issues, have gone to their international offices and have been kind of shocked. Well, I wasn't shocked because I expected, but to find very little there. So there's not much expertise, and it requires people who know what they're doing in the university, not just to say, yes, let's welcome international collaboration, but you have to have people who are trained to do it. You have to have an infrastructure. You have to have an administrative arrangement that will make it reasonably possible to do that. And as we both know so well, you more than me, since you live in the system, that Indian universities and Indian society in general is a hotbed of bureaucracy. So figuring out how to arrange these kind of collaborations is not easy. And as we've pointed out in this conversation so far, all but a few of the top Indian universities, and Jawaharlal Nehru is one of the top ones, doesn't have adequate infrastructure, either human or physical, to really collaborate at the highest level with the best overseas universities. So having given that slightly negative point of view, not negative, pessimistic point of view, I do think there's a huge potential, and there'll be lots of interest from overseas. We see that already. Universities, India's on the map, on the radar screen, because of its booming economy, because there are so many, well-educated and successful Indians who are working overseas in universities. I can think of a dozen American university presidents who are of Indian background. Of course, Silicon Valley is dominated, it seems, by Indians. And, they bring a certain luster or prestige to things in India too, because a lot of them, most of them, I think, were educated at least in part in India before they went abroad, which, by the way, is another big issue. That is attracting the best and the brightest Indian minds back to India.
So if you hold on to that, I have a question on that.
Okay, please go ahead.
So that's great that you pretty much can read my mind what I'm going to ask next. I want to now move to something on a comparative analysis of higher education system, which you have worked for a long time. The book Academic Star Wars, published by the MIT Press that you co-edited last year, presents analysis of higher education sector in 9 Asian and European countries and the efforts to boost productivity and ranking of their universities through something that they call as academic excellence initiatives, or AEIs. I know that India wasn't included in the volume, but how do you see India vis-a-vis other countries mentioned in the volume? Especially, I know China is not mentioned, but Taiwan is, but especially I want you to talk about China, Japan, and Germany. And the reason I picked these countries is very simple. China is similar to India in terms of population, and Japan and Germany are similar to India in terms of their economy. So how do you see India vis-a-vis these countries in particular, as far as higher education and research is concerned?
Well, I'm sorry to be the continuing pessimist, but if you compare India to those countries, they are light years. The book is called Star Wars, so we can continue the space analogy. They are India's light years behind. There's no reason why it can't catch up, and pretty quickly, with the infusion of appropriate funding. But, as I've said at the beginning of this conversation, there are no Indian universities really in the, in the top ranks of the global rankings. India has not had a academic excellence initiative, really. And, its universities don't compare with those 3 countries. If you take China and India, it's an amazing difference. China's now #1 in terms of enrollments, and India is #2. As you point out, the populations are kind of the same. The Chinese economy is still significantly bigger than
Five
the
and a half
Indian one.
times.
Yeah, and it's gonna stay that way for a long time. But they have invested heavily in their top universities. They are part of the of our 9 cases. And what's amazing about China is that they realized 25 years ago that they needed a world-class higher education system, and they have invested heavily. They have invested several billion US dollars in the improvement of the top of their system. And they now have quite a few universities in the top of the rankings. And indeed, the Chinese invented one of the big 3 rankings, the so-called Shanghai rankings, which, by the way, is from a scientific point of view, the best one from in terms of methodology. So they are very, very far ahead. It is said that the Chinese are #1 in terms of patent, or as you say, patent, production, and also close to the top in terms of scientific published articles. I am, by the way, a bit skeptical about that. Nonetheless, a lot of the statistics show it. So the short answer to your important question is India is way far behind and needs to, I think, maybe look at what the Chinese have done with more care. One thing which strikes me about India and China, because I've been to both places, I know much more about India than China. The Chinese are not at all interested in what's going on in India. And the Indians are marginally interested in what's going on in China. I think that's a mistake from both sides. India looks always at the US, the UK, a little bit continental Europe, and not much to the rest of Asia. Doesn't look much at Japan, which I think is a very interesting case, which built up its both economy and higher education system. And by the way, for a variety of reasons, funding being a key part, is currently kind of stagnated. And because other countries are going ahead, is sort of falling behind in higher ed. And there, as our research showed in the Star Wars book, their academic excellence initiative was very small and largely ineffective. So, the Japanese have a lot to learn from the Chinese too.
Yeah.
Again, a long answer to a really important question.
Thank you for that answer. And I want to ask you specifically about China. As you know, that China started a program which is called the 1,000 Talents Program way back in 2007, and has since modified primarily to attract Chinese citizens who are educated and working outside of China. And this has worked miraculously for China, although not necessarily from top to bottom, but I mean by not in all universities, but certainly in the top universities. Do you think India should actually initiate and implement a program like that to attract the best talents? You mentioned already that there are so many Indian diasporas in the US and in Europe, and some parts of obviously outside of the US and Europe, like in Australia. Is it time for India to think about something similar to what China did maybe nearly 20 years back?
Well, it's a complicated question. Let's take China first. They have pumped a lot of money and effort into this effort to get mainly Chinese diaspora people to come back. That has been partly successful. They have gotten quite a few to come back, very often not the very top ones who are settled and quite distinguished overseas in America or the UK, etc., but middle level scholars to go back home, luring them with international level salaries, very good laboratory facilities, and so on. And that's been partly successful. They have found recently, and I think this also resonates a little bit with Indian realities, that it has become more difficult to get overseas Chinese to go back home because of the geopolitical situation and domestic situation in China itself. That is, continuing restrictions on academic freedom, people disappearing from time to time, and academics especially, and intellectuals in general, having to be much, much more careful about what they say and write. And this is important, limited access to information on the web and so on. So the Chinese are now finding it much more difficult to attract people to go home permanently. What they've done as kind of a workaround is to have joint arrangements with overseas scholars who spend part of their time in China and part of their time back in the university in whatever country they have their main appointment. And I think all of this has some resonance for India. Point one about India: the salary level, as you well know personally, does not is not competitive on the international market, and thus it will be a bit difficult to attract scholars to go home. Second point, as we've pointed out several times in this conversation, the scientific infrastructures for people particularly in the STEM fields, but even to some extent in the softer sciences, are not of international standards in India, and that needs to be improved, not just for international reasons, but for domestic, more important, for domestic reasons itself. Point number three, and this has some resonance with China, the Indian academic atmosphere now with the current and future government is increasingly problematical in terms of what I've called in an article I wrote in the Hindu recently, the hyper-politicization of higher education in the country. And I think as that becomes clearer, both in terms of the fear that people may have to express their opinions, again, this is less important in the hard sciences and STEM fields than in other areas. But still, this atmosphere will increasingly permeate the higher education space and will make India, I think, a bit less attractive. Now, it is certainly the case that, take China or other countries, Hungary, Azerbaijan, places that have real authoritarian governments, science goes on, and again in the STEM fields with reasonable distinction. So it's not going to kill it off, but it does make, I think, the atmosphere more problematical for India's becoming a truly sort of global international player.
Absolutely. And I just want to allude that in addition to academic freedom, which is not an option, which is essential to excel anything in education and research, the collaboration of countries or with countries which are in our vicinity, particularly China, Japan, other Asian countries, hasn't happened primarily because of two reasons. Number one, the economy of India wasn't really that good, until recently. And so is China, only it just skyrocketed in the last decade. Number two, recently, because of geopolitical situations, we are not very comfortable in collaborating with them. And where we are, for example, we have an excellent relationship with Japan. And in some of the Southeast Asian countries, language does play a big role in not collaborating with them. As the largest diaspora, Indian diaspora students, who are very familiar with the American system, and I myself being, studied and trained in 3 different continents, Japan, US, and UK, I know that it resonates with us because many of our professors and students are trained there. So it's easy for us to integrate. But nevertheless, I agree with you that I think we should think about collaborating with people in our vicinity more so, because they are also improving their system, and so do we. So we have a lot to learn from each other. Now let's move to something which is more fundamental and often debated among the intellectuals. What is the purpose of higher education? Should higher educational institutions be the places to provide young adults develop critical thinking, a place for liberal education, and a place where they can build their characters alongside knowledge creation? Or you think higher educational institutions be the place for workforce training, or it should be both? And the reason I'm asking this is because there is an obsession with creating universities for workforce training, because there is a thought process that the people who come to the university must get jobs, which is by no means less necessary. But how should universities, especially in India, have to create this balance between these two sides? First, character building, thinking freely, and to develop critical thinking alongside getting training for jobs, particularly when funding is minimal. It's not enough to do both. What do you think India should focus on?
Well, this is the short answer to your question is yes, both. Absolutely necessary. And this is a hot topic in the United States and indeed around the world also, where the by and large, the how to put it, the thrust of public debate on this issue, as in India, is on workforce training. And increasingly, American institutions also, not the elite ones, not the top ones, but others, are focusing more and more on workforce training. I myself, having been educated in a liberal arts tradition personally, and I've found that that's been, and the data support this, very important in one's development as a person and one's development also as an effective worker in the economy, that especially critical thinking these days and communication skills in a rapidly changing economy is absolutely central. So at the same time, as you very correctly point out, getting a job after graduation is important. And it's interesting, in the United States, half the people and more than half of the conservative people, the right-wingers, think that a university education is not particularly useful. They are wrong. They are wrong in the sense of the data, because if you look at a person's, again, I'm talking about the United States, I don't know what the numbers are, if there are any, in India. If you look at the United States and indeed other rich countries, the value of a university degree, even in the social sciences and humanities, which are less remunerative than the STEM fields, the value of a university degree over one's career is dramatically higher than if you don't have a university degree. So those people who think that higher education is not useful for their kids are making a big mistake in terms of the future of their children. But the short answer to your question is that really both. And if you throw out the baby with the bathwater, the baby being kind of a liberal arts approach to higher education, you're making a very big mistake, both for society and for individuals.
Thank you very much, Phil. We are coming towards the end of our conversation. And towards this end, I want to tell our viewers that you are no stranger to the Indian higher education system. You worked in India, goes back nearly 50 years, and you started actually working with the Indian higher education system as a young PhD student. Now, you know it is not a good and happy time for the professoriate globally. And with someone who has the knowledge and the insider view about the Indian system and who has been following the system globally, especially in India. And we touched upon many aspects of it, particularly in terms of academic freedom, in terms of increasing the budgetary allocation, in terms of providing more facilities and infrastructures in the public education system. Is there anything that you want to give the advice to our policymakers? Is there anything that you want to tell what we should do to boost higher education system in India, research in higher education system in India? And is there anything that we can do in a short to medium term that we are not doing?
Well, far be it from a foreigner to give advice to Indians, even a foreigner with great sympathy, admiration, and love for the country, which I've been involved with for, as you say, half a century. Nonetheless, a couple things are clear to me. One, which we started out this conversation with, Indian higher education needs more funding. It always has needed more funding, particularly as India's economy becomes, globally more important, and of course more important for the country itself. Funding is needed for higher education, both to support undergraduate studies in a quality way and to build the research infrastructure. Absolutely necessary. Point two, again, as you've pointed out, as we've discussed, academic freedom and underlined autonomy, to free the higher education system from the all-encompassing bureaucracy that's been so important in Indian development. And we can blame the Brits for this, I suppose, back when, but India has certainly built on it. So I think that's very important. Trying to keep the ethos of higher education, as we've discussed in the last response, in terms of its intellectual freedom, the idea that young people need to have a sense of society, a sense of critical thinking, and so on, as part of their undergraduate preparation, linking the universities to research and making sure that the universities are the main drivers of research in the country and not specialized research institutes. They've played an important role in India, but the more they can be integrated, the better. And workforce training, it's important. And ensuring that, young people have access to good jobs when they finish. And remember that, I don't remember the numbers, but unlike rich countries, and unlike China, for example, a much lower proportion of Indian workers are in the kind of, quote, formal sector of the economy. And how does higher education deal with the informal sector? I have no answer to that question, but it's a very important thing to consider, since so many people are still involved in that informal sector and in agriculture, which again is, quite different than other developed countries. So India has a lot of challenges, but its economy is growing fast. It will soon be one of the world's leading economies, already is, and how higher education fits into that, that context is absolutely central to the future of the country. So I hope this has been useful.
Thank you, Philip. I want to thank you for your time in educating our viewers on the system of higher education globally, especially in relationship what is happening in India, providing us with a comparative view of the same in other countries, and most importantly, telling us what we need to do on the ground to attain excellence in higher education. Thank you once again and goodbye.
Thank you.